But here is my personal hero, Randy Neal. Yay!
Thank you, Pastor Mark. What we're going to do now is in a moment, I'm going to invite our friend Major Elliot Chadoff to come up. He's going to speak for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then we're going to receive an offering, again, for CUFI on campus. Please give as generously as you can. And then we're going to shift gears into a time of Q&A. And I'll just tell you straight up, there's no questions that are off the table. There are some questions that he can't answer, because if he did, he'd have to kill you. But you can try it, and as long as you can frame it as a question. I don't know, there's no way, I don't have the vocabulary and we don't have the time for me to adequately give the man the introduction that he deserves. So I'll press it down to this. He's one of the nation's, one of the international foremost experts on counterterrorism. He's a professor and an expert on terrorism analysis. He is an expert and a professor on military history and military strategy. If you want to flatter somebody and you want to overemphasize that they're an expert in their field, you facetiously say, oh, they wrote the book on that. But if you're inducted into the Israeli Defense Forces, you're going to be given an infantry field handbook, and Elliot literally wrote that book. I've been with him in Israel when we've encountered soldiers, and you can tell the moment, I don't understand Hebrew, but when they're exchanging, he's talking back to soldiers, I can tell by the look of surprise in the soldier's face when they discovered that this is the rascal that wrote that book that made me go through all those things. And so without any further ado, would you give a really warm Tacoma El Shaddai welcome to Major Elliot Chadoff.
Thank you. Make me earn it. Before I begin talking about what's going on in the world in general, in the Middle East in particular, I just want to expand for a moment and reiterate some of the things that Randy said about Yom HaShoah. Because I think that not relating to it, ignoring it, is a sin in its own right. 75 years ago this year, this season, Nazi Germany established a state policy which was called the final solution to the Jewish question. In 1942, Nazi Germany decided to exterminate the Jewish people. And when the war ended, the official number is 6 million. The more recent estimates float up in the 7 to 8 million range, were murdered. In the years after, and I remember in the 1960s, a saying came into vogue, never again. And back in the 60s, when we started saying never again, we mistakenly believed that what we meant was, it can't happen again because the world has learned. Now, a few decades later, unfortunately, we understand that never again doesn't mean that it can't happen again. But when we say never again, we have to mean that we won't let it happen again. In the Passover Haggadah, written a couple of thousand years ago, there's a small section that says that not one has risen against us to annihilate us, but in every generation and generation, they rise up to annihilate us. And the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hands. And I just want to emphasize for a moment that 2,000 years ago, they understood that never again doesn't mean that it can't happen again. So we thought we were clever in the 60s. We've learned over the decades that they were more clever, and they understood. So having said that, I want to start by talking a bit about what's going on in the world, because everything is related to everything today. And with that, sort of zoom into the Middle East and around Israel. When I finish, give you a chance to ask some questions. Randy wasn't 100% accurate. There are questions I don't know the answers to, but I'll make them up. And they'll be credible, consistent, it'll all work. The most important phenomenon that we're seeing today is that the United States, the superpower of the world, is back in the game. For at least 8 years, and I'm going to emphasize the at least, for at least 8 years, the United States has been backing out of the game. And I use the word game, of course, in quotes. Now, I'll tell you now, I'm not going to trying to tell you what's going to be a month or 2 or 3 or 6, and some of you have heard me speak before, and you know that I'm a disciple of 2 great political philosophers, Winston Churchill and Yogi Berra, who both said that it's best to prophesy about things that have already happened. So I don't do prophecy. A bit of projection maybe, but not much beyond that. So I'm not going to tell you where it's going to go in that sense, but I will tell you that it's clear in the past 3 months that American policy and strategy has shifted. For at least the past 8 years, America has followed a policy of appeasement. Now, Churchill, who I really am, I don't know if a disciple, but at least a student of, Churchill defined appeasement as feeding your friends to the crocodiles and hoping they eat you last. Now, I have to say, first of all, I agree 100% with the definition. Appeasement is a very attractive policy, especially for a democracy. Now, attractive doesn't mean right, but attractive is attractive. And why is it so attractive? Let's start with the non-democracies and see sort of the difference. Syria. Syria is headed by a man whose title is president, but his real job description is brutal mass murderer. His name is Bashar Assad. Bashar Assad, with everything that's going on in his country, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in detail a little bit later, Bashar Assad has a 20-year plan. He can have a 20-year plan because he knows that in 20 years, he's only going to be in one of 2 possible places. He's either going to be in the presidential palace or he's going to be in the ground. So he can have a 20-year plan. A president of the United States, and it doesn't matter whether it's the current one or the past one or the next one, when a president of the United States comes into office, he or she knows that in 10 years, they will not be president. In 5 years, they may not be president. Their first test is coming in 2 years. It's called the midterms. And the campaign begins in about 1 year after they come into office. You can't think strategically that way. What an American president does when they come into office is get onto a treadmill that's running at high speed and hope that it doesn't throw them off. Any attempt at strategy is limited in that sort of a time frame. And therefore, appeasement becomes attractive, as long as you have friends to feed to the crocodiles. Because the leader of a democracy, and it's not just the American president, it's true in all democracies, a leader in a democracy essentially operates by what is known as the sentry's prayer. Sentry as in S-E-N-T-R-Y, a guard, a sentry. Do you know what the traditional prayer of the sentry is? Dear Lord, may it not happen on my shift. And therefore, appeasement is good because I can push it down and maybe it becomes somebody else's problem before it blows up in my face. It seems, and I say that it seems because we're watching this now in real time, it seems that the new administration is changing that policy. And the message to the crocodiles is that feeding time is over. And that's a very good thing, except when you stop feeding the crocodiles, they get kind of upset. Now, that doesn't make the world a more dangerous place, because the crocodiles were dangerous before. But it makes it a more immediately dangerous place. Because if you stop feeding them, chances are they're going to look at you and say, you're the next meal. That's about where we are right now in the world, with North Korea, with Syria, with Russia, with Iran, and with a few other players out there, and I think you can put the list together yourselves. They're still not convinced that feeding time is over, because it's happening literally in the daily news programs that we're seeing today. But with the confrontation with North Korea, with the cruise missile attack, retaliation on Syria after his use of chemical weapons, with the talk today of possibly reinstating sanctions against Iran, with the attack on the terrorists in Afghanistan, all in a very, very short period of time, we're seeing, again, a shift in American policy and the beginning of the response on the other side. Now, that's all I'm going to say on that subject, because, again, from here, I wake up in the morning and turn on the news just like everybody else. And life is always full of surprises, especially in the Middle East. But it has pushed the danger to the front. We're seeing it, of course, with North Korea, and I'm not going to talk much about them, but just have to watch the news. What is he going to do? I don't know. I'm talking about the North Korean leader. He probably doesn't know yet what he's going to do. But a spoiled child, brutal dictator with nuclear weapons is not a good thing to have running around out there. Let's keep in mind that he's been that for over 20 years. Okay? So once again, the danger that your press is making into an issue on a day-to-day basis was always there. Now he's just being called on it. Coming around to my side of the world, the Russians aren't happy because they had a pretty free reign in Syria and the Middle East. I had a thought a couple of weeks ago that, if Putin did put Trump into office, you think maybe he's having some buyer remorse right around now? Oops. But Russia is really not that kind of an issue, and I don't want to be misunderstood. Russia is a threat. Putin wants to get back in the game as well. The United States of America is the team to beat for Russia, and there may be a conflict down the road. But the Russians understand their limitations, and he has his limitations. He's also in a position, and Russia is in a position, where they don't have to push forward. The others, on the other hand, do. And here I'm going to cycle around and talk about really the greatest immediate threat on a grand level to all of us. I've actually been saying this, and I'm not the only one, for a number of years now, but Israel's defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, was asked a few weeks ago, what are the three greatest threats facing Israel? And his answer was Iran, Iran, and Iran. Okay. I want to add to that, Iran is also the greatest immediate threat to the United States. On a grand scale. A war may break out with North Korea first. But if we're talking about grand scale threats, we're talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Iranians are on the move, and they've been on the move now for a number of years. And to understand where those movers are coming from and perhaps where they're going, we need to go back a little bit. And I'm not going to give you a long history lesson, but a short one I think is important. In 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, he made a number of statements. Now, I have to tell you, I liked Khomeini. I like Putin. I like Khamenei, Khomeini's successor. I like Hamas. I like Hezbollah. I like honest murderers. They're honest. They tell you exactly what they have in mind, and they mean it. People, how many people do you know who do that? These are murderers who are honest. Now, I don't like them in the sense that I want them as my next-door neighbors. But as a strategic analyst, they make my job very easy. Look, normally, if you know anything about analysis, strategic analysis in particular, strategic analysis boils down to two general categories. One is called capabilities, the other is called intentions. Normally, it's easier to assess capabilities than intentions. Right? If you have a decent intelligence service, and we have in Israel a better than decent one, they come in and they tell you they have this many planes, they have this many tanks, they have this many guns, this many troops, they're trained at this level, they're organized on that level, this is what they're capable of doing. Okay. What are their intentions? I don't know. That's guesswork, that's tea leaf reading. Not with these guys. They tell me. There's no guesswork involved. Here, let's look at them for a moment. Let's start with Hamas. They're the easiest. What does Hamas really want? What's their real intent? Open up their charter and read it. You don't have to read much. Read the opening line of the charter. Israel will exist until Islam obliterates it. Questions? Okay. When the Iranian leadership says we want to wipe Israel off the map, I know what they're planning. By the way, when they say death to America, what do you think they really mean? All right. Here's a bit of advice, and you can write this down. It's always better to believe your enemy's threats than your friend's promises. When they threaten to kill you, take them seriously. If they threaten to buy you ice cream, don't take them seriously. So Khomeini, 1979, tells us. He says, we've created an Islamic Republic. We're at war with our greatest enemy. Who's Iran's greatest enemy? America, the great Satan. When he referred to America as the great Satan, he was speaking in theological terms, not geographical terms. America is the great evil in the world. Get used to it. And we're going to rebuild, resurrect the Persian Empire. If the Persian Empire as a term doesn't speak to you, open the book of Esther, that Persian Empire. 127 provinces, India to Ethiopia, European aspirations, in other words, global. Now, Iran's issue with America is twofold. Number one, it's ideological. America stands for everything Iran hates. Openness, freedom, democracy. How can you run a country like that? They certainly can't. And second, America is the superpower. And if you want to become the empire, you have to take out the superpower. America's the team to beat. Here, I'm going to give away my New York origins. I'm sorry, but I have to do it. America is to global politics as the Yankees are to baseball. I'm sorry. They win often. They lose occasionally. They're always the team to beat, and everybody hates them. That's America. By the way, if you're from New York, you say, good, hate me. Do I care? So For two reasons, one ideological and the other strategic practical, America is Iran's enemy from the Iranian perspective. And it makes no difference whatsoever what American policy will be unless it capitulates to the Iranians. It will be Iran's enemy. So just because you gave $150 billion to Iran last year, that's your tax dollars at work. That doesn't make him your friend. It just means you gave him enough money to buy more weapons and fund more terrorism. Iran has done a few things along the lines of that conflict. I want to mention a couple of them briefly and bring us up to date. One is that they created an organization called Hezbollah in the 1980s. Hezbollah brought suicide terrorism to the world. Hezbollah brought what we call today hybrid warfare to the world. Hybrid warfare is what we're all facing. I'm talking about all the forces that are out there in Al-Qaeda, in ISIS, in the Taliban, in Boko Haram, and we in Hamas and Hezbollah. Meaning terrorist organizations that are trained and organized as military organizations. Many people in this room are old enough to remember the classical terrorists of the 1970s, particularly in Europe, Baader Meinhof, the Red Brigades, those guys. They weren't military organizations. The terrorists we're facing today are military organized terrorists. That's a Hezbollah invention. That organization is operating on every continent, and they have infiltrated the United States of America in very large numbers, particularly through the Mexican border, with the help of your friends in Venezuela. You don't have friends in Venezuela. They're not coming here looking for work. Now, on top of that, Iran is on the move. We have already engaged them, Iranians, along our border. A few years ago, an Iranian general from the the Revolutionary Guards was on the Israeli border with Syria, scouting out the options to establish a new front against Israel out of Syria. So we killed him. By the way, the job is still open if you're looking for work. Along with him, we killed the leader of Hezbollah in that part of Syria, a young man by the name of Jihad Murnia. Imagine naming your son Holy War. Now, Jihad Murnia was, I don't want to use the word apple, he was a grenade that didn't fall far from the tree. His father, Imad Murnia, was a leader of Hezbollah. We took him out a few years earlier in Syria, so when we took out the son, it was a family reunion. We sent him to meet his father. Imad Murnia was responsible for the attack on the American embassy in Beirut. He was responsible for the attack on the Marine barracks in Beirut. And he was the liaison between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran. And one fine day in Syria, we sent him, in Damascus, we sent him off to a better place. His son is now with him. His other son, Jihad's brother, took over his job. I think they want to expand the family reunion. We'll get to them. But the Iranians want desperately to open up a front against Israel along the Syrian border. That's part of what's going on in the Syrian civil war. And that border is heating up. We're seeing it, we're watching it heat up. There were rockets falling this past Friday. There's a lot of stuff that's going on that doesn't make it into the papers. Along with that, Iran is moving beyond. And here, I want to focus on what's happening today in Syria with a look forward, and then talk a little bit about what's going on the borders and give you a chance to ask some questions. The press here, the media, talks about the fact that Iran is seeking regional power, regional hegemony. they're missing the point. They missed the point of the Persian Empire. Iran is thinking global. And I'll give you two indicators of it. Indicator number one is that they have already established a naval base on the Mediterranean in Syria, near a Russian one. And the reason the Iranians want a naval base in the Mediterranean is the same reason the Russians do. They want to be able to get out to the Atlantic. Because anybody who knows anything about global strategy knows the control of Europe is done in the Atlantic. The Germans tried and failed in World War I. They tried again and almost succeeded in World War II. It's not a coincidence that the European Treaty, or the Treaty for the Defense of Europe, is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO. North Atlantic. Because that's really where the war over Europe is fought. In order to be in that war, you have to get out there. Iran has naval bases in the Persian Gulf. That's good for getting into the Pacific, not into the Atlantic. The Iranians are negotiating with the Italians to establish naval bases in Italy. Why do they need naval bases in Italy? If they want pizza, they can order in. But no, Italy is that much closer to the exit through Gibraltar into the Atlantic. By the way, none of this is classified. I don't send classified information by email. Did I say that? This is all open source. It's all out there. But nobody's connecting the dots. The second point is that the Iranians are building nuclear weapons. They're developing nuclear weapons. And they're building ballistic missiles to carry them. They already have ballistic missiles that can reach Europe. They're working on one now, and they're almost finished with it. They'll reach the east coast of the United States of America. They're thinking global. Nobody here is paying attention, unless you consider giving them $150 billion paying attention. In close to Israel, Hezbollah and the other terrorist organizations are feeling the pressure, and we're seeing it along the borders. It's feeling the pressure of the new administration. They don't know how long it's going to last, and Iran is beginning to feel that pressure as well, and you can see belligerency sort of going up in a slow but sure scale. I should also mention something about this in terms of Iran and American policy. Up until not that long ago, 10 years or so, there was a standing policy in the United States, or of the United States, that for a 100-mile radius around an aircraft carrier was declared, an American aircraft carrier, was declared a no-fly zone. In other words, if you flew in within 100 miles of an American aircraft carrier, you got one warning. If you didn't heed the warning, you were swimming, which pilots are not really supposed to be doing. Today, Iranian aircraft fly directly over American aircraft carriers, and the Iranians have made clear that they want to sink one. Though you've probably seen some of the reports, if you follow it, because it's been in the media, of Iranian boats challenging American ships. That's all part of that, and it's increasing as we watch, basically. Likewise, along Israel's borders. That pressure is on, and we are feeling that heightened tension. Now, I'm not going to predict. At one point or another, the American policy and the Israeli policy, we've long had a policy of not appeasing them, will get them to the point where they understand that it's not being pushed down the road any further. And at that point, we take it from an extremely dangerous to an even more dangerous place. A war can break out at any time inadvertently. They shoot at us, we shoot at them, and the next thing you know, it spirals up. But my greater concern, and the one that I think we're watching much more closely in Israel, is the point at which the Iranians in particular come to the conclusion that they have nothing more to gain by waiting. Again, I'm not going to say it's happening in a month, or in 2 months, or in 5, or in 6, but we're in that kind of period. And I just have to mention briefly, we are all used to a very narrow, tight timetable. Again, partly it's democracy, partly it's the CNN phenomenon, and by CNN I mean all the fast food news, that you need, the question is asked now and the answer has to be given now. In the real world, it takes a little bit longer. You remember, bin Laden disappeared for a few years before he was caught and killed. And the media was already speculating that he was dead, because who could be out of the media that long and still be alive? Okay. What all of this means is that Israel's never been in a safe place, but our security has sort of gone through ups and downs. The place that we're in today is that the danger, the immediate danger, is beginning to arc upwards again. Part of it also has to do with amnesia. We fought a war with Hezbollah in 2006. It's 11 years later. They forget. If you know that Israel's history, every 10 years or so, our adversaries have to be reminded that they can't wipe us out. And that 10-year period is basically where we are. So again, not a prediction, but a sort of awareness that we follow those kind of cycles. I want to conclude with 2 things. One, tell you a bit of what that means in terms of the ramifications for us in Israel, and for you as people who support Israel. Then teach a little Torah, because it's what we do, right? We're moving out of a period that I refer to as luxury war. Now, I need to explain that, because luxury and war don't work very well together as terms. For the people on the ground, there's no such thing as luxury war. In other words, for the men and women on the battlefield, whether it's the ground, the air, the sea, it's not a luxury. For decision makers, there can be a luxury, in relative terms. And what I'm about to say is true for all of us as individuals, not just for leaders. If you have an issue that you need to deal with, and it could be a serious issue, if you have time to consult, time to get help, time to bring resources, then you're in a luxury decision-making position. Now again, the issue may be very, very serious, but having time gives you the luxury of being able to bring other forces into play. Take that same issue and have to deal with it right this second, and it's a crisis. Israel has been threatened for decades, but not with that kind of immediacy, the kind of immediacy that we're facing today. Hezbollah has 300,000 rockets facing Israel out of Lebanon. If 2,000 rockets a day are falling on Israel, we don't have luxury. It has to be dealt with immediately. That absence of luxury means that we will not be able to do what we've done for the past number of decades, which is to put into practice what we've been preaching to ourselves all along. And we put it into practice because that's who we are, to be the most ethical military in the world. And by the way, I measure myself against countries like the United States, not Russia and China and those guys. The Israeli military is the only military in the world that has a unit that speaks the enemy's language for the sole mission of calling up enemy civilians on their cell phones and telling them, in effect, we're going to be attacking your neighborhood tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. You shouldn't be home. Consider what that means in terms of intelligence resources, and what it means in terms of personnel resources, and also consider what it means when you tell your enemy what I'm going to be doing tomorrow morning. Of course it's crazy. We're all crazy. What that means, though, sometimes is that they're prepared in such a way that that attack can't happen. You can do that in luxury war because presumably the attack had a reason. If we can't do it tomorrow and we have to put it off till the day after or the day after or the day after, then we have time. If we don't have time, we won't be able to do that. The Israeli Air Force is the only Air Force in the world where there's a rule of engagement that states that before a pilot or a weapons officer can release a guided missile on a target, they must have an alternative target site in an open field to redirect that missile in flight. If there are civilians in the target area before the release, they don't have permission to release it. But after the release, if civilians come into the target area, they have to be able to divert the missile into an open field. Highly ethical, but it means that target that presumably was important and needed to be destroyed will not be destroyed in that attack. Maybe later today, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after, maybe next week. You can do that in luxury war. You can't do it when 2,000 rockets a day are falling on your population centers. And what that means for all of us is that Israel, that's condemned for building houses, right? Well, 700,000 people have died in Syria. Israel that is condemned for taking those kind of actions because they're insufficient to the world. And the world matters, unfortunately, but it does. I don't know if you heard that Saudi Arabia was appointed to the Women's Rights Council in the UN today. You can't make this stuff up. So women's rights. Yes, Saudi Arabia is now a member of the Council on Women's Rights in the United Nations. Don't you feel good about that? No, okay. When we are not able to do those things, the condemnation is going to come that much more heavily. That much more heavily. And even a pro-Israel administration is going to find itself under pressure by a media and by a public opinion that's already out there and against Israel. And that's where people like yourselves come in. Because if there's no counter-pressure, even a pro-Israel administration is going to fold under pressure. Because that's one of the basic rules of democracy. And you need to be able to take a position on that. So let me ask you, do you stand with Israel? Well, first of all, that's appreciated. But I want to teach you something now, a little Torah. You're not really supposed to be standing. You're supposed to be acting. And I know that in this ministry, when I teach a little Hebrew along with the Torah, you'll get it. You know that in Deuteronomy, it says, "V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol meodecha." Oh, you want a translation? And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might. The Hebrew, it's part of the Shema. The Hebrew word for "and you shall love" is v'ahavta. Now, because we're talking about Torah and because we're talking about the Word of God and the words of God, right? It's not the same thing. We can do something that we can't do as well in human literature. We can take that word, which is a kind of strange construct. Would you agree? For that verse. And see where else does it appear. And we can go to Leviticus and find that the exact same word, v'ahavta, appears. It says, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And you shall love. Now, it's interesting. Reacha is really your comrade. I think it's the best translation. You probably know is love your neighbor as yourself. but it's really you should love your comrade, your compatriot as yourself. By the way, anybody know the next words in the verse? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Next words? Going once, going twice. Ani Adonai, I am the Lord. It's an interesting verse in and of itself, right? You shall love your neighbor or love your comrade as yourself. I am the Lord. It's not just, it's kind of a nice idea. The word comrade appears a few verses earlier as well. It says, Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, you shall not stand on your comrade's blood. Okay, now here's interesting. We have connecting words of love, comrade, and don't stand. Now, what does it mean, don't stand on his blood? What, you shouldn't get your feet wet? No. What it really means is that when your comrade's life is threatened, you should not be standing. You should be moving. And to give you an idea of the importance of that lo ta'amod, you shall not stand, it's the exact same grammatical construct as the you shall nots of the Ten Commandments. By the way, I have to tell you, the Hebrew doesn't say you shall not. It says don't. All right? Lo ta'amod or lo tirtzach doesn't say you shall not murder. It says don't murder. And lo ta'amod, don't stand. Our enemies, all of our enemies, are marching. Standing is insufficient. Now is the time to march. With that, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. God bless you.
We'll do some Q&A here. If you do it now. Okay, we're going to go ahead and take up an offering. You guys can go ahead and come up, and if you filled out those note things. Obviously, we don't have any music here during the offering. But the main thing, too, with this standing is don't just stand there with your hands in your pocket, right? No. Okay. But anyway, what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and pray over the offering. But then after that, we're going to be doing Q&A. Okay? So that way, while the offering's being done, we can still keep going and answer any questions. But let's open with prayer. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, we just thank you so much that we can come together and learn more about you, about your kingdom, about the nation of Israel, about your people. Father, draw us all closer to you, closer to them. And we just ask this in your name. Amen. Okay, who has any questions? Raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, go ahead. With Erdogan's new powers, he's just been granted as well.
Okay, the question is about Turkey and its gaining power. Turkey is absolutely an issue. By the way, here again, Erdogan, another one of those guys who I like, kind of, sort of, right? Because he tells us what he has in mind. Erdogan said, and said it publicly, that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the fall of the Ottoman Empire. He wants to rebuild it. We know this. He's not quite there yet, but he's getting closer every day. And this most recent referendum was another step along in that direction. Yes, go ahead.
If you're making out checks, make them out to Christians United for Israel. Or just CUFI.
Turkey is certainly part of the issue. The only thing I would say about it at the moment is that it's the third of the three, Iran, Russia, Turkey. And since we're faced with much more serious threats, all of us again, at the moment, Turkey is one of those next year, 2 years, whatever kind of a thing. because after he totally consolidates power, he's also going to have to reorganize his military. He still has some work to do. Unfortunately, we're in a world where a threat a year or two down the road is so far down compared to everything else that we're facing that we can actually say that. But Turkey is absolutely, certainly on the radar screen.
Anybody else?
You're in shock, yes.
I have a question.
Go.
You said that this is not the time to stand, it's the time to move.
Yes.
And I certainly agree with that, but as an over 70-year-old woman on retirement, I pray, what else can I do to help my comrades in Israel?
Thank you. That was an excellent question. And I'll repeat it. And let me generalize it. I said to move, not to stand. What can any of us do, not just a 70-year-old woman? Look, one thing should be clear. We're not looking for recruits. And I say it, sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I mean it seriously. And I'll tell you not only my personal philosophy, but Israel's policy philosophy. We don't want anybody to fight our battles for us. We want support, military, political, and otherwise, and I hate to say it this way, and then get out of our way. Okay? But then, so what can you do? And the answer is simple to give, and it goes like this. I mentioned before, even a pro-Israel administration is going to find it difficult to stand up to the opposition. This is still a democratic republic. So far, anyway. The real power in this country is not in an Oval Office in Washington, it's in rooms like this. Let me be clear, and this is not just about the immediate topic of democracy, it's true in general. If you don't use power, you lose power. I'm saying with everything, okay? Now, first of all, if you didn't vote, you lose your license to complain for 4 years. But you know what? But if you didn't, or if you did, it's okay. You get a second chance. And the second chance is not in the next election, and this is the direct answer to your question, it's immediate. If your leaders do what you don't like, let them know, and let them know clearly, respectfully, but clearly. Equally, and maybe even more important, if they do something you like, let them know too and thank them. First of all, it's the right thing to do. But also keep in mind that when they do something you like, somebody else doesn't like it and they're letting them know. And it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, it would actually be a very good thing if they hear from the side that likes it. We're much more prone to scream we don't like than we are to do the very, very simple, proper, and courteous thing and to say thank you, and we're with you. Just those two things, keeping up obviously with what's going on and responding to it, is already more than 99% of the rest of the population is doing.
So, how do you think Iran will try to destroy America? If it's through nuclear arms, how close do you think they are to actually developing a nuclear arsenal?
Okay, the question is, how do I think that Iran will try? First of all, I don't know that Iran will try to destroy America. But the question is, how do I think Iran will do it, and how close are they to nuclear arms? So first of all, destroy is an overstatement. Defeat is sufficient as far as they're concerned. Utter destruction, even Germany wasn't destroyed in World War II. But defeated for sure, and defeated heavily. How will they do it? There's a saying by one of the 19th century chiefs of the German general staff that no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. So I don't even know how it's going to start. I certainly can't tell you what day 2 is going to look like. I can tell you that they've made it very clear that they want to sink an American aircraft carrier. I can tell you that with virtual certainty, the Hezbollah infiltration of the United States is certainly part of their strategic plan. Beyond that, difficult for me to say. How close are they to nuclear weapons? Way too close. And even if it's 5 years, it's way too close. I plan on being around in 5 years. And if it's 10 years, it's way too close because I plan on being around in 10 years as well. Let me put it this way. The issue is not when they will have a nuclear weapon. And I think this is important for us to understand. I read a lot of nonsense. As a matter of fact, most of what I see printed in the American press is nonsense. But I read a lot of nonsense about how the Iranians want a nuclear weapon because they want to defend themselves against American and Western aggression and that sort of thing. So aside from the nonsense of American aggression, the idea that they want to develop nuclear weapons for that is nonsense for a much more basic strategic reason. If they needed a nuclear weapon to defend themselves or protect themselves, they need one. One. Once you're a nuclear power, you're a nuclear power. People don't want to mess with you. Note North Korea. Okay? They don't want to mess with you. If they wanted one nuclear weapon, they could have bought one. They could have bought one from the Koreans. They don't want one because one does not provide you with an offensive capability. In order to have an offensive nuclear capability, you need lots of nuclear weapons because you need enough to have that after you've used them, you still have some. Okay, keep this in mind. The only time nuclear weapons have ever been used in history was in a non-nuclear world. Okay, in other words, when the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, the second bomb, there were no more nuclear weapons in the world. In a nuclear world, you can't use your entire nuclear arsenal because you need to hold some back in reserve. So the Iranians don't want 1 or 2 or 3, they want 10 or 20. And that's going to take them a bit of time to develop. But once they get to the point where they can develop them, they're going to build them very, very quickly. So again, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, it's all way too close. Does Israel have nuclear weapons? I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. We will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. That's Israeli policy. Next question. That was easy.
Yes.
My question is kind of a follow-up to this gentleman's here. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the Iranians' end game. You know, because on the one hand, it seems like they say they want to conquer the world for Islam. On the other hand, they say they want to spark a big conflict that the big conflict piece doesn't seem to jive with conquering the world for Islam because they would be destroyed. So
Okay. Sure. The Iranian endgame, conquer the world for Islam, and so on. Look, first of all, I'm not convinced that it's for Islam exclusively. Okay? And here, once again, we have to be a little bit careful with the simplistic analytics in the United States. Most of us, and by the way, I say this as somebody who teaches in a university, and my students don't know what to do with me because I tell them stuff that they don't hear from their other teachers. One of the things they teach you here in university, generally, is to find out the cause of something. Now, I personally don't believe in single cause explanations. Tell me, just something very simply. You're all here tonight. Why are you here? Is there one reason or a whole bunch of reasons? Right? Because normally when we do something, we don't do it for a single reason. We do it because there are a few reasons, and maybe even more than a few, that coincide that bring us to where we are. Okay? Likewise, it's not Islam, and I'm not saying that it's not Islam, right? But it's also Persia, and that's something that's totally discounted. national identity, historical national identity. And by the way, before we get terribly excited and think they're so crazy, why are the Jews back in the land of Israel? For ancient historical identity, national reasons, right? So either we're all crazy or maybe this has something to do with the way we do things in general, we as people. So that's number one. I don't know that they have a clear end game. I'm not convinced that they do, because I think that what's driving them is much more dangerous than that. And here, yes Islamic, no Islamic, let's leave for a moment. It's fascist. It's fascist. Not Nazi. Nazi is its own class, but fascist. And I'll tell you two things about fascism that concern me that I see in them. And here you can use the German and the Italian and the Japanese models. Fascism must expand. It cannot stop. If you know your history of World War II, you know that both the Germans and the Japanese should probably have paused at the end of 1940. Take a deep breath, digest what they've swallowed, take a few years to get back, and then start again. Both of them in 1941 continue to move forward, the Germans in Russia and the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. Why? Because fascism has to keep expanding. It's one of those rules. For that, you don't need an end game, because you have to do it just because you do it. The second thing that concerns me about fascism, and I see it in Iranian and others, is that fascism invariably underestimates democracies. Okay, we can understand why. I understand why. It's our fault. Now, I'm not saying that we should change it, but it's our fault. Everything that we know that makes us strong, they see as weakness. Openness, freedoms, individual rights, all of that stuff that we take for granted, that's who we are. They look at it and they say, how can you run a country that way? And once again, and I'll use the Japanese example because it's as good as any, what were the Japanese thinking in Pearl Harbor? We know, we have their records. They said, we're going to attack Pearl Harbor, we're going to fight a year of victorious battles. They didn't get that either, but it doesn't matter. And then the Americans will lose their will to fight. Oops. But why? Because it's a Western, democratic, decadent society, and we'll push them over. By the way, bin Laden thought exactly the same thing on 9/11. Exactly the same thing. And the Iranians believe it as well. Now, unfortunately, America has helped them believe that by policies like begging them and then paying ransom for them to return sailors who were taken captive in international waters, and then former Secretary of State, I love saying that, former Secretary of State Kerry, calling them up and thanking them for releasing them after having taken them illegally. So when you're sitting in Tehran, you say, wow, these people they're not only a weak democracy, they're also a bunch of clowns. That's dangerous. So I think that's more the issue than sort of a grand strategic endgame.
Do you think that's what they think when Israel trades one prisoner for 100 terrorists?
Okay, is that what they think when Israel trades one prisoner for 100 terrorists? No. No, I don't think so. I think that it raises the value to them, and that's why I'm against it, but they still see Israel differently. And here you have to know, a couple of years ago, ISIS made a public statement that they fear one country in the world, and that's Israel. Because we take them seriously. By the way, taking your enemies seriously is a good thing. It helps you, and it gets across to them, you should respect the rattlesnake right up until you cut its head off. Right? But don't take it lightly. And America has basically taken it lightly, right? ISIS is the junior varsity, things like that. That's not the way to treat dangerous adversaries. So I can disagree with the policy, but I don't think it has the same effect.
Yeah, back row.
What's going on in France with the nationalists versus the globalists and the
Wow, yeah. Look, the French elections are in the middle. Like I said, I don't do prophecy. I do think, though, that without going into which is more and which is less, because here also let's be clear on something. This is true in the United States. It's true in Israel. It's true in Europe. What they say on the campaign trail and what they say after they've been elected is not necessarily the same thing, right? I mean, I know you're shocked, but most elected officials don't exactly keep all of their campaign promises, right? Okay, so I'd be a little bit careful. Obviously, there are directions and that sort of thing. I think what's important is that Europe is beginning, hopefully not too late, to get a clearer picture of the mess that they're in. And if it's not too late, whether they solve it one way or another is kind of their issue, but we're beginning to see it. We're seeing it already in Sweden, we're seeing it in France, in Belgium, in Denmark, even in Germany. The beginnings of a shift in opinion in terms of what's happening within on the continent. Again, I'll leave that one as a wait and see.
One of the Israeli newspapers came out and said if Le Pen was elected, all the Jews need to run to Israel.
Okay, an Israeli newspaper said if Le Pen is elected, all the Jews need to come to Israel. Yeah, I was just going to say, what's the connection, right?
My question is about confronting Iran and the options that are available. We sort of lost economic sanctions game. It sounds like now it's more of a military option. What are your thoughts about regime change?
Okay. Confronting Iran, we've sort of lost the economic option with the sanctions. Now there's a military option. What are my thoughts of regime change? Obviously, regime change is something that can't happen externally. And America is not invading Iran as it did Iraq. I personally don't see it happening in the near future in Iran. And I say that I don't see it. That doesn't mean it can't happen tomorrow. But the indicators are not there. The indicators were there in other countries. And in the last wave of demonstrations, I'm talking about a few years ago, they didn't have the critical mass. I would suggest for all of us that we be very, very careful in assessing what's going on in a country from an outsider looking in. And I'll just give you one simple example. And again, at least a few of us are old enough to remember the Vietnam era. All right? It didn't look so good on the TV screens. I'm talking about the demonstrations. I'm talking about students being shot on college campuses. You remember that, right? Buildings being burned. Right? There was a serious period. Was the regime threatened? Not even close. The president wasn't even, in other words, the individual wasn't even threatened in his office, let alone the regime itself. So we should be careful because we have that, again, I'll use a CNN model, but we have a CNN view of it on the TV screen. It wasn't anywhere near as deep as some of the pundits were making it out to be. So I don't see that happening. Confrontation-wise, I think we're beginning to see an American policy in that direction, and that American policy has to be draw lines, make statements, and by the way, international strategy and policy is almost identical to raising children. For exactly the same reason. The world is anarchical and children are anarchical. And the rules are simple. Never make a threat that you're not willing to carry out. Be consistent and make clear what you want from them. That is something that hasn't been done for the past decade or so. And now maybe, again, I'm cautious about it, maybe we're beginning to see a shift in that direction. Now the question becomes, again, what will the crocodiles do?
Okay, over here, yeah.
Okay. So the question is, we're almost 100 days into the administration. Has there been any sign of greater cooperation with Israel on a range of subjects? I won't list them. There hasn't been a huge shift for an interesting reason. It's already there. Okay, and here I think that it's important to understand a bit of it's not so much a paradox as a disconnect. The past 8 years saw, and it's not a great secret, not exactly a friendly American administration to Israel. Having said that, the American relationship with Israel is as good as it has ever been and better. Okay? And it's an interesting, it's not a paradox, it's a disconnect. What that means is that over the past few decades, the American-Israeli relationship has gone beyond whoever's sitting in the Oval Office. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. A whole bunch of reasons. In purely military, and that's something that I can speak to directly, though I can't go into details that I can't go into. We've come to work together at such a high level that the relationship has become professional, institutional, and not based on higher policy. Now, a truly anti-Israel administration, which, by the way, the Obama administration was not truly, deeply anti-Israel. It was not friendly. There's a difference. It didn't sever those institutional ties. And professional institutional ties, once they're there, are very strong and very solid. Whether it's information intelligence sharing, and we've done a lot of that in both directions. By the way, don't put down the American military so quickly, okay? Whether it's in methods and tactics, in all sorts of things across the boards, sharing knowledge of weaponry, sharing knowledge of the enemy's methods. It's something that we do on a regular basis. Americans come to Israel, American officers and troops, and train with us. We send people here to train with the United States, and training together means discussing and trading information. So that's been going on. I can't answer specifically, because I don't know, on a higher policy level. I can say that I've seen it filter down on a lower level, but once again, we're already in very, very close relationship.
Go ahead. How complex are all the coordinated are the activities that you have in North Korea and Iran?
How coordinated are North Korea and Iran? They're coordinated for sure. They're in a relationship. Iran has certainly gotten nuclear technology from North Korea. Coordinated on the level of immediate policy, I don't think so, but I can't say that with certainty. I think that what we're seeing is more a reaction on both of their parts to a constant, which is the changing policy of this administration. So what we're seeing is parallel rather than coordination. Okay, so the security barrier, and it's not a wall, it's almost all fence. Jews and Arabs live on both sides. So how does it promote safety? It promotes essentially, I should say it enhances more than it promotes, because it makes it more difficult for terrorists on the other side to get into Israeli population centers. And here, it's just a very simple rule, with all due respect to the barrier. And I think the barrier has its place, and again, there's no single cause. But it's combined with good intelligence work, good tactical work. And here, I have to tell you, just full disclosure, as an infantry officer, I'm a maneuver guy, not a static guy. I think the barrier is very nice, but where I come from, a barrier doesn't do the job, it helps you do the job, okay? And anybody who thinks that putting up a wall is going to solve it doesn't understand. There has not yet been designed the physical obstacle that will stop a determined human being. Okay, what stops a determined human being is a more determined human being on the other side who wants to stop them. Okay, so the barrier gives you, that comes back to the luxury crisis I was talking about earlier, it gives you the luxury of being able to have a few more minutes or more to respond.
Okay, one more question. One more. No.
It's his house.
You have something to... Okay, go ahead.
You talked about North Korea at different times, and it's well known, the Iron Dome. I served there, and I wish or hope that they've got something like that.
Who's that? South Korea has something like that?
I wish there was some way that the Iron Dome was in South Korea with HR, with Air Force, with the Turks. What would it take to get something like the Iron Dome, which is effective in South Korea?
Above my pay grade, but let me say something about the Iron Dome. And I say this, first of all, full disclosure, I am devoutly low tech. I still navigate with the sun, the moon, and the stars. So I say that so that you understand and you appreciate what I'm about to say. The Iron Dome is virtually miraculous technology. Having said that, it is of extremely limited utility in full-scale warfare. Okay, in other words, if Hamas or Hezbollah or whomever fires 6 rockets, 8 rockets, 10 rockets, the Iron Dome is extremely effective. 100 rockets, it's not so effective. 200 rockets, it's not effective at all. Because the number of batteries that you would need to deal with that is beyond the capability of any country. As a security weapon, it's terrific. As a military weapon, and understand the difference, right? As a military weapon, it's extremely limited. The volume of fire in warfare simply cannot be confronted with a weapon like the Iron Dome. So it serves its purpose, and again, I'm not belittling it. It gives the government, and this is part of the luxury war that I was talking about, it gives the government the ability to sit back and say, you know what, let's wait another day and let's wait another day because the Iron Dome is dealing with it. Not on the scale that we're talking about in full-scale war, not even with Hezbollah, let alone with North Korea.
Randy, did you have something you were going to say?
No, I just say that would be the last one.
Yeah.
Okay.
One more thing I just want you to reiterate real quick, and that is this. How many of you remember the 2006 Lebanon War? How many missiles did they have then?
Okay, they started that war with 20,000. The Air Force took care of a bunch of them. They hit Israel with 4,000 over 5 weeks.
And now how many?
Today they have 300,000, and their doctrine is to hit Israel with 2,000 a day, as opposed to 4,000 over 5 weeks. So understand we're in a completely different anticipation of intensity.
Let's give him a big hand. Thank you, Elliot, so much for coming. Thank you, Randy, for being here. And we thank Christians United for Israel. Let's give them a standing ovation, all of them. Randy, did you have any closing words that you wanted to say? Okay, the main thing I want you to know is we have for free on those back tables magazines from Christians United for Israel. Let's close with prayer and then we'll go. Father, we just thank you so much again that we could come and hear about you and your people and how we're to not stand against our compatriots' blood, but we're to be involved. And I just pray that each and every one of us here would become active participants in loving your people, in loving you, and in loving your Torah. And we just thank you in your name. Amen. You're dismissed. Don't forget this Saturday, if you can come, we're right here.